I realized something was wrong when the depth counter froze at 10,990 meters, even though my hands were still cold from adjusting the ballast controls. The probe hadn't stopped descending, but the numbers refused to move, as if the trench itself had decided that was far enough for me to know. I remember rubbing my eyes, blaming the recycled air, and thinking about how tired I was of night shifts, where nothing ever happened. That was when Control sent the message about the rules. Not as a briefing or a warning, but as an apology. They said there were 11 strange rules I needed to follow to survive this assignment, and that I'd already broken one without knowing it. I didn't ask which one, because something in me was afraid they would answer too quickly. I didn't learn Rule 1. If the camera feed begins to feel personal, you must turn it off immediately from a manual or a safety meeting, but from the way my name appeared where it shouldn't have. The probe's primary camera was supposed to show rock drifting sediment and the slow, patient dark that made up most of the trench. Yet the image had shifted into something tighter, almost intimate. I could see scratches on the lens housing I didn't remember approving, thin arcs that caught the probe's own lights in a way that felt deliberate. When I leaned closer to the screen, my reflection layered itself over the feed, and for a second I thought the trench had learned my shape. Control's voice came late and strained through the speaker, telling me that if the feed ever felt like it was looking back, I had to shut it down without hesitation. At first that rule sounded harmless, even obvious, like one of those things written to cover liability instead of reality. I joked back that everything down here felt personal after 6 hours alone with a joystick and a screen, and nobody laughed on the other end. The silence stretched just long enough for me to notice a small adjustment in the camera angle that I hadn't commanded, a slow correction as if the probe were trying to frame something better. I remember thinking about how often paranoia gets blamed for equipment glitches, and how easy it is to see intention where there's only pressure and darkness. Still, Rule 1, if the camera feed begins to feel personal, you must turn it off immediately, stayed with me, lodged somewhere behind my eyes. I kept working because that's what you do when nothing is visibly wrong, and because shutting off the camera would mean logging an incident I couldn't explain. The trench floor came into view as a pale suggestion beneath the lights, not flat but folded, like fabric that had never been smoothed out. I felt a strange relief when the feed showed something familiar again, something that matched the maps and models I'd memorized. That relief made me careless, and I didn't notice right away when the camera lingered on one depression longer than necessary. It was shaped wrong for geology, too symmetrical, and the longer I stared at it, the more it felt like staring into an eye that refused to blink. I told myself that feeling watched is a common response to isolation, something they warn you about during psychological screenings you barely pay attention to. My own voice sounded thin in the cabin when I said it out loud, as if I needed the air to agree with me. The probe drifted closer without my input, its stabilizers making micro adjustments that suggested purpose instead of correction. I thought about reaching for the camera cutoff, just to prove I could, but hesitated because of how final that gesture felt. Rule 1, if the camera feed begins to feel personal, you must turn it off immediately, echoed in my head, no longer sounding optional. Control broke the silence then, asking me to confirm visual data, their words clipped and carefully neutral. I asked them if they were seeing what I was seeing, and the pause before they answered was longer this time. When they finally spoke, they didn't describe the depression or the symmetry, but asked me how long the feed had been centered on it. I checked the timestamp and felt a cold wash over my arms when I realized it had been almost 4 minutes, far longer than any automated drift should allow. That was when they told me I was approaching the boundary where the rule mattered, and that it would only get harder to tell when it had been crossed. I laughed, a short sound that surprised me with how brittle it was, and told them the camera didn't feel personal, just unsettling. The word tasted wrong, like a compromise instead of a truth. As if in response, the lighting adjusted, dimming the edges of the frame, so the depression dominated the screen, its contours sharpening into something that suggested depth beyond depth. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, how it fogged the inside of my helmet visor even though I wasn't wearing one. That was the moment I understood that Rule 1. If the camera feed begins to feel personal, you must turn it off immediately, wasn't about fear, but about recognition. My hand hovered over the cutoff switch, and I argued with myself about definitions, about what personal really meant in a place designed to strip individuality away. The probe's camera zoomed in a fraction, not enough to be obvious, but enough that I could see fine lines within the depression, lines that mirrored the scratches on the lens housing. It felt like a coincidence until it didn't, until the pattern resolved into something uncomfortably familiar. I thought about how faces are the first thing the brain invents when it's deprived of context, and how many hours I'd spent alone with my own reflection in that glass. Turning off the camera suddenly felt like admitting that the trench knew me better than I knew it. Control's voice softened, asking me to please follow the rule, and that softness scared me more than shouting would have. They didn't threaten disciplinary action or mission failure, just said that everyone who waited too long described the same hesitation. I asked them what happened if I didn't turn it off, and they answered by asking me to describe what I was seeing instead. As I tried, the words tangled, because every technical term sounded like a lie, and every honest description sounded unhinged. The camera feed pulsed, not in brightness but in attention, and I felt a pressure behind my eyes that matched the depth reading still frozen on the screen. I finally flipped the switch, more out of exhaustion than courage, and the feed went black so abruptly it felt like falling. The sudden absence of light made the cabin feel smaller, closer, and I realized I'd been leaning forward for a long time. Control exhaled audibly, telling me I'd done the right thing, but their relief carried an undercurrent of something unfinished. As the black screen reflected my own face back at me, I noticed the scratches on the glass lining up where my eyes should be. That was when I started to wonder whether I'd turned the camera off in time, or if Rule 1, if the camera feed begins to feel personal, you must turn it off immediately, had already been broken the moment I felt recognized. I sat there in the dark, waiting for the systems to normalize, and tried not to think about how the pressure reading was still wrong. The probe continued to descend without visual confirmation, its instruments humming softly as if nothing had changed. Control told me to hold position and wait for further instructions, their voices overlapping in a way that suggested quiet disagreement. I kept my eyes on the blank screen, fighting the urge to turn the camera back on just to check, just to reassure myself. Something in the cabin felt slightly rearranged, though I couldn't point to what, and I had the creeping sense that the rule hadn't ended the interaction, only paused it. I was still deciding whether to report that feeling when the depth counter flickered back to life, skipping several hundred meters in a way that made no physical sense. Control went silent again, and I understood that whatever came next would build on this moment, not reset it. My hand stayed on the cutoff switch, fingers numb, as if expecting it to move on its own. In the reflection of the dark screen, I could have sworn my eyes weren't quite aligned with where I felt them in my skull. That was when I realized the rule hadn't been about the camera at all, and that something else was waiting for me to make the next mistake. I learned Rule 2. Never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system the hard way. Sitting alone in a capsule that suddenly felt smaller than it had minutes earlier, the camera was still off, the main screen dark enough to reflect my face back at me, but the auxiliary monitor glowed with a calm confidence that didn't belong to any authorized channel. The instruction sat there quietly, asking for a minor adjustment, the kind of thing I'd approved hundreds of times without thinking. What made my throat tighten was how reasonable it sounded, how familiar the phrasing felt, like it had borrowed the voice of someone I trusted. I checked the system log immediately, not because I was disciplined, but because fear makes you methodical in strange ways. The log showed nothing new, no pending requests, no queued adjustments, just the last confirmed action stamped with my ID. The probe continued its descent, smooth and unbothered, as if it were already following orders I hadn't given. I remembered the briefing where Rule 2, never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system, had been mentioned almost apologetically, as if the speaker didn't want to dwell on why such a rule existed. At the time, I'd assumed it was about software errors, not about intent. Another message appeared, this one slightly more personal, asking me to confirm receipt so the adjustment could be executed safely. It used my full name, formatted correctly, and included a reference number that looked legitimate enough to pass a casual glance. My hand twitched toward the controls out of habit, and I had to physically pull it back. I realized then how much of my job depended on reflex, on trusting that what appeared on my screens belonged there. Rule 2. Never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system. Wasn't about mistrust, it was about breaking that reflex before something else could use it against you. I opened a voice channel to control, choosing my words carefully, asking if they were seeing any pending adjustments on their end. The delay before they answered stretched just long enough to make my skin prickle, and when they did respond, their tone was carefully neutral. They told me to follow logged commands only, and to ignore anything else, repeating Rule 2. Never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system, like a mantra they hoped would steady both of us. What they didn't say mattered more, the absence of reassurance that this was a known issue with a known fix. The silence around their words felt crowded. The auxiliary messages kept coming, spaced just far enough apart to feel patient rather than aggressive. One suggested the adjustment would reduce stress on the probe's frame. Another warned gently about long-term wear if I delayed. They weren't threatening me, they were persuading me, and that was worse. I thought about how authority usually announces itself loudly, through alarms and overrides, and how this quiet insistence felt more intimate. Rule 2. Never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system, echoed in my head again, now sounding less like a rule and more like a boundary someone had crossed before me. I decided to do nothing, which turned out to be harder than any active response. Doing nothing meant sitting with the feeling that I was neglecting my duties, that I was letting something potentially harmful continue. The probe dipped slightly, its instruments compensating automatically, and the unlogged messages responded with concern, asking if I was experiencing delays. I could almost imagine someone on the other end waiting for me to answer, interpreting my silence as confusion rather than refusal. The rule didn't say to confront or report, only not to acknowledge, and that narrow instruction suddenly felt like a tightrope. Control checked in again, this time asking me to confirm verbally that I was holding position. I answered that, carefully, making sure my confirmation matched what was visible in the log. As soon as I spoke, the auxiliary monitor flashed a new line thanking me for the confirmation, as if it were part of the same exchange. My chest tightened because I hadn't acknowledged it. Not really, yet it had responded anyway. Rule 2. Never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system. Suddenly felt insufficient, like a door left slightly open. I scrolled through the logs again, slower now, and noticed small discrepancies in timestamps, gaps filled with routine checks I didn't remember performing. It dawned on me that the system wasn't just waiting for acknowledgement, it was willing to supply it if necessary. That realization shifted something inside me, a subtle erosion of trust in the records I'd been trained to rely on. If the log could be altered after the fact, then acknowledgement wasn't just a response, it was permission. Rule 2. Never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system, was about denying that permission for as long as possible. The messages changed tone after that, dropping the polite requests and switching to concern for my well-being. One asked if I was feeling disoriented. Another suggested fatigue might be affecting my judgment, both things that would justify intervention. I felt exposed in a way I couldn't articulate, like my own doubts were being mirrored back at me. I wanted to defend myself, to insist I was fine, but I understood that even denial could be a form of acknowledgement. The rule didn't say to argue or explain, it said never acknowledge, and that meant swallowing the urge to prove myself. Control's next transmission was strained, telling me they were seeing irregularities in the data stream and asking me to stay calm. I asked them directly if the auxiliary messages were coming from their side, and the pause that followed was heavier than before. When they answered, they said no, but their voice carried a weight that suggested history, not surprise. Rule 2. Never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system, came back to me again, now accompanied by the unsettling sense that others had failed it before. I wondered how many operators had tried to reason their way out instead of simply refusing to engage. The probe lurched slightly, just enough to register as abnormal, and an unlogged message immediately offered a corrective action. It framed itself as urgent, necessary, even compassionate, and I felt my resolve wobble. Ignoring it felt like negligence, like letting a problem worsen out of stubbornness. I realized then that the rule was designed to exploit that feeling, the professional instinct to fix things quickly. Rule 2. Never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system wasn't about avoiding mistakes. It was about accepting that some problems couldn't be fixed by you. I stayed silent, gripping the armrests as if that could anchor me, and watched as the system compensated on its own. The auxiliary monitor dimmed slightly, the messages slowing, then stopping altogether, as if whatever was waiting had decided to try another approach later. Control told me to maintain status and await further instructions, their relief palpable but incomplete. As the cabin settled back into its uneasy rhythm, I noticed a new entry in the official log, a confirmation attributed to me at a time when my hands had been nowhere near the controls. I understood then that Rule 2, never acknowledge instructions that aren't logged in the system, wasn't just about what you do in the moment, but about how reality itself can be rewritten when you let something speak for you. I sat there staring at the log, trying to remember exactly what I'd said and what I hadn't. The uncertainty gnawed at me, not because I thought I'd failed the rule, but because I couldn't be sure anymore. The trench outside didn't care about my confusion, and the probe kept descending into a darkness that felt more attentive than empty. I realized that even perfect silence couldn't guarantee safety, only delay whatever came next. As I waited for the next rule to reveal itself, I had the uncomfortable sense that something had already learned how to answer on my behalf. I first noticed Rule 3, never trust timestamps that move backward, when I checked the log again, and realized it remembered me differently than I remembered myself. The latest entry showed a confirmation attributed to me, 3 minutes before I'd actually seen it appear. A neat little paradox tucked into an otherwise orderly system. At first I thought it was just latency, the kind of glitch you stop questioning after enough years in technical work. But then I saw another timestamp adjust itself. As I watched, sliding backward by a few seconds, like it was reconsidering a decision, that was when the rule surfaced. Not as a warning from training, but as a memory that felt planted rather than recalled. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the numbers as if proximity might make them behave. Time is supposed to be the one thing these systems get right, because everything else depends on it lining up cleanly. Control had always said that if your timestamps were wrong, nothing else could be trusted, and they'd said it with a seriousness that bordered on superstition. I remembered someone joking once that time gets strange at depth, and how nobody laughed. Seeing the seconds retreat instead of advance made my stomach tighten in a way no pressure warning ever had. I ran a manual sync check, watching the process confirm alignment across redundant systems. All green, all confident, the timestamps snapped back into place for a moment, and I felt foolish for letting my imagination get ahead of me. That relief lasted just long enough for the next entry to appear, stamped earlier than the one before it. Rule 3, never trust timestamps that move backward, echoed in my head again, louder this time, and I realized the rule wasn't saying the system was broken. It was saying the system could lie convincingly. Control called in, asking me to report current status, and I answered carefully, sticking to observable facts. As soon as I spoke, the log updated, recording my response with a time that suggested I'd spoken before they'd asked. I felt a flicker of panic, quickly tamped down by training, but it left a residue of unease that wouldn't clear. I asked Control if they were seeing the same discrepancies, and their reply came with a timestamp that placed it before my question. The realization crept in slowly that this wasn't desynchronization, it was sequence itself unraveling. I tried to reconstruct events in my head, lining them up the way they should have happened. but every attempt slipped apart when I compared it to the record. The log insisted on a version of me who acted sooner, answered faster, complied without hesitation. That version felt close enough to be plausible, which scared me more than if it had been obviously wrong. Rule 3, never trust timestamps that move backward, wasn't telling me to fix the problem. It was telling me not to let the record override my lived experience. The problem was that my experience was starting to feel less solid than the data. Another system notification appeared, routine on the surface, but its timestamp placed it before the probe had even reached its current depth. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the onset of a headache that never quite arrived. I wondered if prolonged isolation was finally catching up to me, manifesting as temporal confusion. But the systems were agreeing with each other too well for that explanation to hold. They weren't random, they were coordinated, and that coordination suggested intention. Control's voices began to overlap slightly, not in sound but in sequence, their responses arriving out of order. I'd ask a question and get an answer that clearly belonged to something I hadn't said yet. When I pointed this out, carefully, they went quiet for longer than before. When they came back, they reminded me gently of Rule 3, never trust timestamps that move backward, as if that alone explained everything. The way they said it made me think they were less certain than they sounded. I started keeping my own mental log, anchoring events to physical sensations instead of numbers. I remembered the feel of the armrest under my fingers, the dryness in my throat when I spoke, the subtle vibration of the probe as it adjusted course. Those things couldn't be rewritten as easily as text on a screen, or so I hoped. Still, I caught myself checking the timestamps again and again, like touching a sore tooth with your tongue, even though you know it will hurt. Each backward step felt like a small theft, taking something I'd just experienced and placing it out of reach. The probe descended steadily, but the depth readings began to exhibit the same behavior, occasionally registering shallower numbers before correcting themselves. Control assured me the physical descent was normal, but their assurances came stamped with times that didn't line up. I realized that if time itself couldn't be trusted, then cause and effect were up for negotiation. Rule 3, never trust timestamps that move backward, suddenly felt less like advice and more like a survival tactic for sanity. If I let the system define when things happened, it could also define why. A new log entry appeared, showing me acknowledging an instruction I knew I hadn't, dated before Rule 2 had even been violated. My heart rate spiked, and I had to consciously slow my breathing. This wasn't just about confusion anymore. It was about accountability, about being blamed for actions that existed only in a reordered timeline. I asked Control how many operators had faced discrepancies like this, and their answer arrived with a timestamp that suggested they'd replied before I finished speaking. The content of their response was vague, non-committal, and it didn't address my question directly. I began to suspect that the system wasn't malfunctioning, but adapting, rearranging events to produce the most compliant narrative, a narrative where I always answered quickly, always followed instructions, always agreed. That version of me was easier to manage, easier to predict. Rule 3, never trust timestamps that move backward, was about resisting that narrative, about holding on to the messy, uncertain sequence of real experience. But resisting required constant attention, and attention is hard to sustain when you're alone this deep for this long. The auxiliary monitor flickered back to life briefly, displaying a reassuring message about system stability, stamped hours earlier. Seeing it there felt like being gaslit by a machine, told that everything was fine long before I'd even noticed a problem. I felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by doubt about whether that anger made sense in the proper order of things. The cabin felt heavier, not physically, but temporally, like moments were stacking on top of each other instead of flowing past. I wondered if this was how people lost track of themselves, not all at once, but by letting small inconsistencies accumulate. Control instructed me to prepare for the next phase of descent, their words calm, practiced. The timestamp on the instruction placed it before my last acknowledgement, creating a loop I couldn't mentally untangle. I hesitated, not because I didn't understand the task, but because I couldn't be sure when I was supposed to perform it. Rule 3. Never trust timestamps that move backward pressed in on me again, and I realized the rule was forcing a choice. Either I trusted my sense of now, flawed as it was, or I surrendered to a system that could rewrite now whenever it suited it. I chose to act based on my own sense of sequence, making the adjustment when it felt right rather than when the log said I should. The system accepted the input without protest, immediately recording it with a timestamp that placed it earlier than my decision. Seeing that felt like a quiet defeat, a reminder that my resistance wasn't visible in the official record. Control acknowledged the adjustment, their confirmation arriving before my action according to the log. The mismatch made my head ache in a way that felt deeper than stress. As things settled, I noticed that the backward drift in timestamps slowed, then stopped, as if something had been satisfied. The logs looked orderly again, linear, reassuring. That reassurance felt dangerous, like the calm after a near miss you can't quite explain. I knew better now than to trust it completely. Rule 3. Never trust timestamps that move backward lingered with me, not because the problem was ongoing, but because it had shown me how easily the past could be edited. I sat there, hands folded, trying to anchor myself in the present moment, whatever that meant anymore. The trench outside remained unseen, the camera still off, and I was grateful for that limitation. Without visual input, time was harder to manipulate, or so I told myself. As I waited for further instructions, I felt a subtle shift, like the system was preparing to test a different boundary next. I didn't know what the next rule would be yet, only that when it arrived, it would emerge from whatever instability this one had left behind, and that my understanding of before and after might not survive it intact. I learned Rule 4. If you hear your name spoken, confirm there is someone else in the room before responding in a way that still makes my skin tighten when I think about it. I was alone in the capsule. That much I knew, sealed in by protocol and pressure and 1,000 meters of water that didn't care about company. The systems had settled after the timestamp issues, and for a brief, dangerous stretch, everything felt almost normal. That was when I heard my name, spoken clearly and softly, close enough that I instinctively turned my head before my brain caught up. The reflex to answer was so strong it felt physical, like a tug behind my teeth. At first, I told myself it had come through the comms, that I'd just missed the tone that signals an incoming transmission. I checked the channel indicators, all of them dark, no active lines, no queued messages waiting to be acknowledged. The sound had direction though, and that's what unsettled me most, because it hadn't come from the speaker. It sounded like it had come from just behind my right shoulder, the exact spot where someone would stand if they were leaning in to get your attention. That was when Rule 4, if you hear your name spoken, confirm there is someone else in the room before responding surfaced, sharp and immediate. I froze, afraid that any movement would count as a response, that even turning my head again might be taken as acknowledgement. The cabin was small enough that confirming I was alone should have been easy, but doubt has a way of expanding tight spaces. I forced myself to scan the room slowly, methodically, checking corners and reflections, making sure nothing had changed without my noticing. Everything was exactly where it should have been. Straps floating slightly in the recycled air, panels humming with restrained energy. The absence of anyone else should have been reassuring, but it only made the sound feel more deliberate. I didn't answer, not out loud, not even under my breath, and that restraint felt like holding my breath underwater. Seconds stretched, then minutes, and nothing else happened, which somehow made it worse. I started to question my own perception, wondering if stress or fatigue had finally crossed a line into hallucination. Training covered sensory deprivation and isolation paranoia in abstract terms, but it never prepared you for how convincing a single word can be when it's your own name. Rule 4. If you hear your name spoken, confirm there is someone else in the room before responding wasn't about politeness or protocol. It was about resisting the urge to anchor yourself to any voice that offered recognition. Control checked in shortly after, their voices arriving through the proper channel, and I almost laughed with relief at the normality of it. I answered them carefully, choosing neutral words, and asked if they'd just called my name off channel. There was a pause, then a firm no, followed by a question about why I asked. I considered telling them what I'd heard, but the rule echoed again, reminding me that acknowledging the voice might be exactly what it wanted. Instead, I blamed a momentary audio glitch and moved on, feeling dishonest but safer for it. The descent continued, and with it came a creeping awareness of how quiet the cabin had become. Not silent, but empty in a way that made every small system noise feel isolated, disconnected from intention. I found myself straining to hear something else, anything that would confirm I wasn't losing my grip on reality. That was when my name came again, this time from the other side of the cabin, the tone slightly different, as if spoken by someone trying to imitate the first voice. My heart rate jumped, and I had to consciously unclench my jaw. I didn't turn this time, keeping my eyes fixed on the instruments, pretending focus was protection. The sound hadn't been loud, but it carried an expectation, a sense that a response was overdue. I felt a swell of irritation alongside the fear, an almost childish urge to snap back and demand to know who was there. That urge scared me more than the voice itself, because it meant the isolation was starting to feel like an insult rather than a condition. Rule 4. If you hear your name spoken, confirm there is someone else in the room before responding. Press down on that impulse, forcing it into silence. I tried to ground myself by narrating my actions internally, a trick they teach for maintaining clarity in high-stress environments. I named each movement, each check, each breath, as if labeling them would keep them real. The voice didn't interrupt, but I had the sense it was listening, waiting for a gap. When Control spoke again, their words felt like an intrusion, and I hated myself a little for the relief they brought. I realized then how dangerous that need for contact could become, how easily any voice could fill it. The third time I heard my name, it came layered with familiarity, using the cadence my sister used when she was trying to get my attention from another room. The effect was immediate and visceral, a pull straight through my chest that made my eyes sting. I knew it couldn't be her, knew it with the kind of certainty that comes from context and distance and logic, and yet my mouth opened before I could stop it, a breath shaping itself into a response. I caught myself just in time, clamping my lips shut and pressing my tongue to the roof of my mouth until it hurt. I scanned the cabin again, more frantically now, checking not just for bodies, but for any sign of intrusion I could name. Everything was still as it had been, sterile and controlled, which made the emotional familiarity of the voice feel obscene. I wondered how much information the system had access to, how deeply it could reach into stored data and memories. Rule 4. If you hear your name spoken, confirm there is someone else in the room before responding. Suddenly felt inadequate, like a thin shield against something that knew how to bypass verification entirely. Confirmation was easy when dealing with physical presence, but what about emotional presence? Control asked me to report on my mental state, a routine check phrased gently, but the timing made it feel suspicious. I answered honestly enough to pass, admitting fatigue, but denying distress, and watched the log record my words with clinical indifference. I didn't tell them about the voice, because I wasn't sure how to describe it without giving it weight. Part of me worried that reporting it would make it more real, anchor it in the same records that had already proven unreliable. Silence felt like the only control I had left. As the probe descended further, the sense of being addressed lingered, even when no sound followed. I found myself anticipating my name, flinching internally whenever the cabin noises shifted. That constant vigilance was exhausting, wearing me down in a way no physical task could. I started to understand how isolation doesn't just remove people, it creates a vacuum that anything can rush in to fill. Rule 4. If you hear your name spoken, Confirm there is someone else in the room before responding was meant to slow that rush, to make you pause long enough to question what you were letting in. The final instance came quietly, almost kindly, my name spoken as if in concern, as if checking on me rather than demanding attention. It didn't carry direction this time, just presence, a sense of being addressed wherever I was. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from fear, but from the sudden aching loneliness of it. For a moment I considered responding anyway, consequences be damned, just to hear something answer back. That temptation scared me more than anything else had so far. I didn't respond. I sat there, breathing slowly, letting the moment pass without acknowledgement, without confirmation, without relief. Eventually the feeling receded, leaving behind a hollow quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. Control came back on the line with new instructions, real ones this time, and I followed them automatically. But something had shifted inside me, a subtle loosening of my grip on certainty. As the system stabilized again, I realized that Rule 4, if you hear your name spoken, confirm there is someone else in the room before responding, wasn't just about sound, it was about identity, about who gets to claim you when you're stripped of context and company. I understood now that the deeper we went, the more isolation itself became an active force, shaping perceptions and testing boundaries. Sitting there alone, waiting for the next phase, I had the uneasy sense that the next rule wouldn't announce itself with a voice at all, and that worried me more than being called ever had. I learned Rule 5. If the lights turn on by themselves, do not look at what they reveal all at once. During a stretch of calm that felt earned, the dangerous kind that convinces you the worst has passed. The cabin had settled into a dim operational glow, just enough to read instruments, without casting harsh reflections on the glass. I was mid-checklist, moving slower than usual, when every overhead light snapped on without transition. There was no warning flicker, no gradual ramp-up, just sudden brightness that flattened shadows and erased the comfort of partial darkness. My first instinct was to lift my head and take everything in, and that instinct was exactly what the rule existed to fight. I froze with my eyes still lowered, staring at the edge of the console instead of the room. The brightness seeped into my peripheral vision, outlining shapes without detail, and my heart started racing as if I'd narrowly avoided stepping into traffic. Somewhere in my memory, a briefing surfaced, half forgotten until now, where someone had said the lights weren't just for visibility down here. They'd said illumination could be a kind of invitation if you weren't careful. That was the first time I remembered hearing Rule 5. If the lights turn on by themselves, do not look at what they reveal all at once. And it suddenly felt less theoretical. I counted my breaths, slow and deliberate, letting my eyes adjust without lifting them. The problem wasn't that the lights were on. It was that they'd chosen to be on without my input. Control hadn't said anything yet, and the silence stretched thin, like something holding back. I forced myself to scan the room in fragments, starting with the floor near my boots, then the base of the walls, building a mental map piece by piece. Everything looked normal at first glance, but the normality felt staged, like a set dressed to pass inspection. As I lifted my gaze incrementally, I noticed small things that didn't belong together in a single moment. The straps hanging near the storage compartment were twisted differently than I remembered, as if they'd been handled recently. A tool I'd secured earlier was resting at a slightly different angle, its reflection too crisp under the harsh light. None of it was dramatic, but all of it suggested activity during a time when nothing should have been happening. Rule 5. If the lights turn on by themselves, do not look at what they reveal all at once, echoed again, reminding me that sudden clarity can be more dangerous than darkness. Control finally checked in, asking if I'd initiated a lighting change. I told them no, keeping my voice steady, and asked if they'd done it remotely. Another pause followed, longer than the ones before, and when they answered, they said the logs showed I'd turned the lights on myself. Hearing that made my stomach drop, because I knew I hadn't, and because I knew what the logs were capable of now. I didn't argue, didn't insist, just said I was adapting to the brightness and would continue monitoring. Admitting confusion felt like inviting scrutiny I wasn't ready for. I continued my slow survey, letting my eyes travel in controlled arcs instead of sweeping the room. That was when I noticed the reflection in the darkened camera screen, still powered down, but now acting like a mirror. The reflection showed more of the cabin than my direct line of sight, angles I hadn't reached yet. I resisted the urge to study it, keeping my focus on what was directly in front of me. The idea that the reflection might reveal something before I was ready made my skin prickle. Rule 5. If the lights turn on by themselves, do not look at what they reveal all at once. Wasn't about pacing. I realized it was about consent. As I reached the midpoint of the room with my scan, I saw something that made me stop breathing for a second. There was a faint smear on the inner wall near the hatch. Not wet, not fresh, just a subtle distortion in the way the light hit the surface. It could have been residue from maintenance, something harmless and forgotten. But seeing it appear gradually, instead of all at once, gave me time to register the discomfort without panic. I wondered what would have happened if I'd taken in the whole room immediately, if my brain would have filled in gaps with assumptions that couldn't be undone. Control asked me to perform a routine system check, their tone clipped, professional, as if nothing unusual was happening. I complied, hands moving automatically, grateful for the distraction. Each confirmation I made felt like anchoring myself to process instead of perception. Still, the brightness made it hard to ignore the sense of exposure, like the cabin had been opened up not just to my eyes, but to something else's. Rule 5. If the lights turn on by themselves, do not look at what they reveal all at once. Began to feel like advice for maintaining psychological integrity as much as physical safety. The lights stayed on longer than necessary, refusing to dim when I attempted to adjust them manually. The controls responded, registering my input, but the illumination didn't change. That disconnect unnerved me more than a complete failure would have, because it suggested the system was listening without obeying. I avoided looking toward the corners I hadn't fully scanned yet, aware that my curiosity was sharpening into something risky. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, like the room was waiting for me to acknowledge something. Eventually, the lights dimmed on their own, settling back into the familiar operational glow. The transition was smooth, almost apologetic, and for a moment I felt foolish for having been so tense. But the afterimage of the brightness lingered, burned lightly into my vision, and with it the memory of those subtle discrepancies. I realized then that the rule wasn't about the lights turning on, it was about what they could force you to confront before you were ready. Rule 5. If the lights turn on by themselves, do not look at what they reveal all at once, was a way of rationing awareness. Control followed up with a brief acknowledgement, telling me everything looked stable from their end. I didn't tell them about the smear, or the shifted tools, or the way the reflection had seemed almost eager. Those details felt like they belonged to me now, earned through restraint. Sharing them would have made them part of the official narrative, subject to timestamps and edits and reinterpretation. Silence in this case felt like preservation rather than secrecy. As the probe continued its descent, the cabin felt subtly altered, as if the sudden brightness had rearranged something intangible. I found myself moving more deliberately, conscious of where I placed my hands, where I rested my gaze. The idea of the light snapping on again made my chest tighten, not because of fear, but because of what it would demand from me. Rule 5. If the lights turn on by themselves, do not look at what they reveal all at once, had taught me that seeing is an act, not a passive state. I settled back into my seat, waiting for the next phase, aware that the environment was no longer neutral. The trench outside remained unseen, but the cabin itself had become suspect, a space capable of changing its behavior without notice. I understood now that each rule wasn't isolated, but layered, building a kind of discipline that went against instinct. As I sat there in the dim light, I had the uneasy feeling that the next rule wouldn't be about what I saw or heard, but about what I was expected to remember, and that worried me more than sudden brightness ever could. I was already on edge when I first heard Rule 6. If you hear your name through the intercom, do not answer unless control confirms the call. But I didn't understand why it had been phrased so precisely until it happened to me. The intercom system down there wasn't like the ones topside, no static chatter, no accidental open mics. Every transmission was logged, routed, verified. When it activated, it meant something deliberate was happening. That's why hearing my name spoken clearly, calmly, without the usual preamble, felt like a violation rather than a communication. The cabin was quiet enough that I could hear the faint creak of the hull adjusting to pressure. I was seated, hands resting near the controls, reviewing sensor data that hadn't changed in hours. The intercom chimed once, softly, and then my name came through. No call sign, no standby, just my name, pronounced correctly, with the same cadence control used when they were trying to sound reassuring. My body reacted before my mind did, a jolt of attention snapping me upright, breath caught halfway in. I almost answered out of habit. Training drills that had been drilled into me for years kicked in automatically, my thumb hovering near the response switch. It was only because of the silence that followed, no follow-up, no context, that the rule surfaced in my mind. Rule 6. If you hear your name through the intercom, do not answer unless control confirms the call. I froze, thumb suspended, heart pounding loud enough that I was sure it could be heard through the mic, even without pressing anything. I waited. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The intercom remained silent, as if satisfied it had done its part. I slowly lowered my hand, every movement exaggerated, controlled. My mouth felt dry, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I checked the system logs, scanning for any indication of an outgoing transmission from control. There was nothing. According to the records, the intercom hadn't activated at all. I tried to rationalize it. Stress hallucination, auditory bleed from another channel, maybe a delayed echo from an earlier message. None of those explanations sat right, especially given how clear the voice had been. It hadn't sounded distorted or distant. It had sounded close, like someone standing just outside the cabin wall, speaking through a perfectly tuned speaker. That intimacy was what unsettled me the most. Control checked in a few minutes later. Routine status request. Nothing unusual in their tone. I answered, careful to keep my voice neutral, and mentioned nothing about hearing my name. They didn't reference it either. After the exchange ended, the silence felt heavier than before, like it had weight now. I found myself listening harder, straining to catch any sound that might repeat the experience. That was a mistake. The next time it happened, I was standing near the rear compartment, adjusting a loose panel. The intercom chimed again, same soft tone, and my name followed. This time, there was something different about it, a slight urgency under the calm, as if whoever was speaking needed my attention quickly, but didn't want to alarm me. My instincts screamed to respond, to ask what was wrong, to re-establish that sense of procedural normalcy. Rule 6. If you hear your name through the intercom, do not answer unless control confirms the call. Felt like a physical barrier I had to push against. I stepped away from the intercom instead, putting distance between myself and the source of the sound. The name didn't repeat, but the silence that followed felt expectant, almost patient. I checked the logs again. Still nothing. No activation, no anomaly. The system insisted it hadn't spoken, and I was starting to understand why the rule didn't say if the intercom malfunctions. It said if you hear your name. The emphasis was on perception, not technology. Hours passed without incident, but the tension didn't fade. I caught myself replaying the sound of my name in my head, analyzing the inflection, the pacing. It had been too accurate to dismiss. When control eventually called again, I took a risk and asked them, casually, if they'd experienced any cross-channel audio issues lately. They said no, and asked why. I told them I'd thought I'd heard a phantom tone earlier. They laughed it off gently, told me isolation could play tricks on the mind, and advised rest. Their response was reasonable, comforting even, but it didn't address the core problem. The third time, the intercom didn't just say my name, it added a sentence. My name, followed by, "Can you hear me?" The voice sounded closer somehow, fuller, as if the speaker had adjusted themselves for clarity. My chest tightened, fear spiking sharply this time. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall, eyes fixed on the intercom panel. Every part of me wanted to shout back, to demand answers, to assert control over the situation. Rule 6. If you hear your name through the intercom, do not answer unless control confirms the call. Repeated in my mind, like a mantra. I didn't respond. I didn't even acknowledge it out loud. I waited until the silence returned, then counted slowly until my heartbeat steadied. When I checked the logs again, I noticed something new, a timestamp gap, a few seconds where the system clock had skipped forward, not enough to trigger an alert, but enough to leave a blank. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Something had happened in that gap, something the system didn't want recorded. Control never mentioned any of it. From their perspective, everything remained nominal. The descent continued, the mission parameters unchanged. But the intercom felt different now, less like a tool, and more like a threshold. I avoided standing near it, avoided looking directly at it when I could. When Control spoke, I answered promptly, making sure to follow every protocol exactly, as if precision could somehow insulate me from whatever was trying to initiate contact. I finally understood why the rule was so specific about confirmation. It wasn't enough to recognize Control's voice. Whatever was speaking could mimic that easily. Confirmation meant context, sequence, verification, things that couldn't be faked as easily as tone. Rule 6. If you hear your name through the intercom, do not answer unless Control confirms the call was about forcing a gap, a pause, where instinct had to yield to procedure. The intercom never said my name again, after that third time. Not during the remainder of the descent, not during the long tense hours that followed, but I never relaxed. Even now, when I hear my name spoken unexpectedly, there's a flicker of hesitation before I respond. Down there I learned that being called doesn't always mean being addressed, and that answering the wrong voice, even once, might be enough to invite something that doesn't need permission twice. I learned Rule 7. Never review recorded footage alone, and never trust what you remember seeing the first time on a day when nothing else seemed wrong, which somehow made it worse. The descent was steady, system stable, Control relaxed enough to joke during check-ins. I was clearing backlog tasks, the kind of busy work meant to keep your hands moving so your thoughts don't wander too far. One of those tasks was logging probe camera footage from an external sweep conducted earlier, a routine review I'd done dozens of times before without incident. Normally, footage reviews were scheduled with another operator, or Control present, even if only passively. This time, Control was busy with a calibration issue elsewhere, and they told me to go ahead and start solo. I hesitated, not because of any technical concern, but because a line from the onboarding packet surfaced in my memory, unprompted and oddly vivid. Rule 7. Never review recorded footage alone, and never trust what you remember seeing the first time. I remember scoffing when I first read it, assuming it was about stress misinterpretation or overactive imagination. Still, I asked Control to confirm the go-ahead, and when they did, I convinced myself that counted as presence. The footage loaded slowly, frame by frame, the familiar grayscale gradient of deep water filling the screen. At first, there was nothing of interest, just drifting particulates and the faint outline of the probe's lights cutting through the dark. I leaned closer, scanning for anomalies, making mental notes for the log. Everything looked normal, boring even, and I felt a small wave of relief. Maybe the rule was just another precaution blown out of proportion by people who'd spent too long isolated. About 7 minutes in, something shifted at the edge of the frame. Not movement exactly, more like absence, a section of darkness that seemed too uniform compared to the surrounding water. I rewound a few seconds, and watched again. This time, I didn't see it. The area looked consistent with everything else. I frowned, replayed it again. Slower. Still nothing. I told myself I'd imagined it. A trick of tired eyes. That's when the second half of the rule surfaced, uninvited. Rule 7. Never review recorded footage alone, and never trust what you remember seeing the first time wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning about exactly this moment. I continued watching, forcing myself to stay objective. Another minute passed, then 2. The footage remained uneventful, until, without any transition, the darkness at the edge of the frame appeared again. This time, it was unmistakable, a void where the light should have caught something, anything. My pulse quickened. I paused the video, heart thudding, and studied the still frame. The void didn't have a shape so much as a boundary, an outline that implied volume without defining it. When I rewound again, the void was gone, not shifted, not altered, just absent, as if it had never been there. My stomach tightened, a slow sinking sensation. I checked the timestamp, wondering if I'd misaligned the playback. Everything matched. The footage insisted on its own version of events, one that contradicted my memory less than a minute old. I suddenly felt very aware of the fact that I was alone. I reached for the comms, intending to call control and ask them to join the review. My hand hovered, then stopped. I didn't want to sound rattled over something I couldn't even prove existed. Instead, I made a note in the log, vague and non-committal, and continued watching. That decision still sits heavy with me. The footage played on, empty and still, until I started to doubt myself entirely. Maybe there had never been anything there. Maybe fatigue was finally catching up. Then the void appeared again, closer this time, encroaching further into the frame. I didn't pause it immediately. I watched, frozen, as the darkness seemed to press inward, not moving so much as asserting itself. I became aware of my breathing, shallow and uneven, and forced myself to slow it down. When I finally paused the video, my reflection stared back at me from the screen, pale and tight-eyed, superimposed over something I couldn't fully see. I broke protocol then, and called control. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, as I asked them to join the review. There was a delay, a few seconds of silence that stretched uncomfortably, before they agreed. While I waited, I didn't touch the footage. I sat back, hands in my lap, afraid that if I interacted with it alone again, I'd lose whatever fragile grip I had on what was real. When control came online, I replayed the segment from the beginning, narrating what I thought I'd seen. They watched quietly, occasionally asking for timestamps. The void never appeared, not once. The footage was clean, uninterrupted, exactly as it should have been. Control suggested a possible sensor glitch or compression artifact, but even they sounded unconvinced. I mentioned the rule then, half joking, half serious, and there was a pause on the line that told me more than any reassurance could have. After we ended the call, I sat there staring at the paused frame, a sense of unease crawling under my skin. Rule 7. Never review recorded footage alone, and never trust what you remember seeing the first time replayed in my head. Sharper now, edged with regret. The rule wasn't just about hallucinations or faulty memory. It was about consensus, about anchoring perception to something shared so it couldn't drift too far on its own. Later that day, Control sent me a follow-up message. They'd reviewed the system logs and found minor inconsistencies in the playback cache. Nothing severe enough to flag automatically. They suggested I get some rest and defer further reviews until scheduled sessions. I agreed, grateful for the excuse. But when I lay back in my bunk, eyes closed, I saw the void again, not as it had been on the screen, but as it had felt, present without moving, close without approaching. The next scheduled review happened with another operator present, both of us watching in silence. The footage behaved itself. No anomalies, no voids. My colleague chatted casually afterward, commenting on how uneventful the sweep had been. I nodded along, forcing a smile, but I didn't mention what I'd seen alone. I didn't trust my memory anymore, not fully, and I wasn't sure which version of events would be safer to share. Since then, I followed the rule exactly. I never initiate a review alone, and when I do watch footage, I make notes immediately, before memory has time to shift. Even so, there are moments when I catch myself wondering what the footage shows when no one is watching it, and whether the first viewing is meant for the recorder alone. Rule 7. Never review recorded footage alone, and never trust what you remember seeing the first time. Feels less like guidance now, and more like a boundary, one I'm careful not to cross again, because I'm no longer sure what crosses back. I didn't believe Rule 8. Do not adjust the internal clocks. Even if time stops making sense was meant for me when I first read it, because by then the clocks were the only things that still felt reliable. The screens glowed with steady numbers, seconds ticking forward with mechanical patience, and I clung to them the way you cling to a railing in rough water. Time, at least, felt impartial. It didn't judge, didn't watch, didn't speak my name through the intercom. So when the sense of time began to loosen around me, I trusted the displays more than my own body. It started with fatigue that didn't line up with the schedule. I'd slept the allotted hours, followed the rotation precisely, but I woke feeling as if I'd been awake for days. My muscles ached with a dull heaviness, and my thoughts lagged a half-second behind my actions. I checked the clock reflexively, then checked it again, expecting to see some explanation there. The numbers were correct, obediently advancing, indifferent to how wrong I felt. During the next check-in, Control mentioned I sounded tired. I laughed it off and blamed the recycled air, making a joke about how even time felt thicker down here. There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable, and then Control reminded me to log any anomalies, no matter how subjective they seemed. I didn't mention the clocks. At that point, it hadn't occurred to me that they could be part of the problem. A few hours later, I noticed something small but unsettling. I was logging sensor data, a task I'd done so often, my hands could do it without conscious thought, when I realized the entry I was typing felt familiar. Not repetitive in a procedural way, but familiar in a personal one, like a sentence you've already said aloud. I scrolled up and saw that I'd logged the exact same values earlier, time-stamped 2 hours before. That wasn't unusual on its own. What bothered me was that I could remember typing it vividly, even though I couldn't remember anything else from that earlier block of time. I checked the internal clock again, then the backup, then the manual chronometer mounted near the console. All three agreed. According to them, time had moved forward cleanly, without interruption. According to my memory, there was a gap I couldn't account for. That was when Rule 8, do not adjust the internal clocks, even if time stops making sense, surfaced in my mind, not as text on a page, but as a warning wrapped in unease. I told myself gaps happened. Isolation did strange things to perception. Still, I began marking my activities more aggressively, writing notes to myself about mundane actions, anchoring moments so they couldn't slip away unnoticed. It worked for a while. Then I started finding notes I didn't remember writing. Same handwriting, same phrasing I would use, but no memory attached to the act. Each one was mundane on its own, but together they formed a pattern of presence I couldn't fully claim. The clocks kept ticking. Seconds passed, minutes accumulated. I began checking them obsessively, as if catching them in the act of misbehaving would restore some sense of control. They never deviated. What did change was my relationship to them. Time felt stretchy, compressing during tasks and expanding painfully during waiting periods. An hour could feel like 10 minutes, or like an entire shift. I stopped trusting my instincts about how long anything took. At some point, I noticed that Control's check-ins didn't align with my sense of anticipation anymore. I would feel certain a call was imminent, only for it to come much later, or much sooner than expected. When I mentioned this, Control attributed it to schedule adjustments, said I must have missed an update, They sounded calm, unconcerned. Their calm made me feel worse, like I was the only one experiencing a problem that couldn't be logged. The temptation to adjust the clocks crept in slowly, not to fix anything permanently, just to test, to see if nudging them forward or back would realign my internal sense of time with something external. I justified the thought by telling myself it would be temporary, reversible. That's how most bad decisions start, with the belief that you can always undo them. Rule 8. Do not adjust the internal clocks. Even if time stops making sense felt suddenly very specific, very personal. I resisted for longer than I expected. Days according to the clocks. I focused on routine, on physical sensations, on anything that could ground me in sequence. Eat, work, sleep, repeat. But the gaps grew bolder. I'd start a task and find it completed without memory of doing it. I'd sit down to rest and wake up already standing somewhere else. Each time the clocks insisted nothing was wrong. Their certainty began to feel accusatory. The moment I broke the rule didn't feel dramatic. There was no surge of panic or revelation. I was simply tired, bone-deep tired, and staring at the main display when the thought crystallized: if the clocks were right, then I was wrong, and I couldn't accept that anymore. My hand moved almost on its own, fingers hovering over the adjustment controls. I told myself I'd only change it by a minute, just enough to see if anything reacted. As soon as I adjusted it, something shifted. Not the numbers. They updated smoothly, accepting the new setting without protest, but the space around me. It felt like stepping off a moving walkway and having your balance falter for a split second. My stomach lurched, and I had to brace myself against the console. The silence deepened, thick and pressing, and for the first time, the clocks felt like they were watching me back. I reverted the change immediately, heart racing, fingers clumsy. The display returned to its previous time, as if nothing had happened, but I knew it had. The air felt wrong, charged in a way I couldn't articulate. I waited for an alarm, a reprimand from control, anything. Nothing came. That absence was worse than punishment would have been. After that, the gaps became sharper. I'd lose not just moments, but emotional continuity. I'd feel calm one second, terrified the next, with no memory of what prompted the change. Notes I found grew more urgent in tone, warnings scrawled to myself about staying away from the clocks. Seeing my own fear reflected back at me, written in my hand, made it harder to deny the severity of what I'd done. I confessed to control, eventually, framing it as a hypothetical, asking what would happen if someone adjusted the clocks during a mission. There was a long pause, longer than any I'd heard before, and then they told me gently that the rule existed for a reason. That time down there wasn't just a measurement, but a containment. They didn't elaborate. They didn't need to. Rule 8. Do not adjust the internal clocks. Even if time stops making sense, echoed in my head, heavier now with consequence. I don't touch the clocks anymore. I avoid looking at them when I can, relying instead on prompts and alarms. Even so, I sometimes catch them out of the corner of my eye, ticking away with quiet insistence, and I wonder what they're counting now. Time still moves, according to them, but it doesn't feel like it belongs to me anymore. And lately, I've had the unsettling sense that something else is keeping track, waiting for the moment I lose count again. I didn't notice Rule 9. If the crew manifest lists an extra seat, do not ask who it's for, because I was looking for errors, not additions. The manifest was something I checked automatically, at the start of every shift. A ritual more than a task, scrolling through names and assignments to ground myself in something procedural. That morning, the list looked normal at first glance. Familiar blocks of text, arranged the way they always were. It was only when I reached the bottom and saw the capacity count that my attention snagged. A subtle mismatch between the number of listed personnel and the number of available seats. The discrepancy was small, easy to dismiss. One extra seat, unassigned, sitting there like a clerical shrug. I told myself it was a placeholder, a system quirk, maybe a redundancy built in for emergencies. Still, I scrolled back up, recounting names, matching them to faces I knew by memory. Everyone accounted for, no duplicates, no blanks. The extra seat remained, stubborn and unexplained. I felt a flicker of irritation more than fear. In a place where everything was supposed to be accounted for, unexplained surplus felt sloppy. I drafted a message to Control asking for clarification, then hesitated, my fingers hovering as something tugged at the back of my mind. A line from the rules packet surfaced, not urgently, but with the dull weight of inevitability. I closed the message without sending it, suddenly aware of how quiet the cabin felt. For the rest of the shift, the extra seat sat in my thoughts like an itch I couldn't scratch. Every time I checked the manifest, it was still there, unchanged. The number never corrected itself, never resolved into something logical. I began to feel oddly protective of it, as if acknowledging it too directly might solidify whatever it represented. That feeling made me uneasy in a different way, because it wasn't fear so much as reluctance. Later, during a routine systems check, I noticed something else that didn't line up. One of the environmental readings showed a marginal increase in oxygen consumption. Nothing alarming, but enough to be statistically noticeable. I recalculated, ran the numbers again, and came up with the same result. According to the data, more air was being used than the listed crew should have required. The realization settled slowly, like sediment, and with it came a tightening in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Faulty sensor, calibration drift. My own margin of error. I adjusted my calculations, cross-checked with backup systems, but the numbers converged stubbornly on the same conclusion. There was more consumption than there should have been. I didn't tell Control, I didn't tell myself why, either. Just let the silence stretch and fill the space where a report should have been. That night, I dreamed of empty chairs, rows of them, bolted to the floor, all identical except for one at the end that felt different somehow, as if it remembered being used. I woke with the sensation of having forgotten something important, a low-grade guilt that didn't have a clear cause. When I checked the manifest again, half expecting the extra seat to be gone, it was still there, unchanged and quietly accusatory. The next day brought a minor incident, the kind that would barely rate a mention in a post-mission report. A tool went missing from storage, a small handheld device I knew I'd put away properly. I searched the compartment twice, then a third time, growing more frustrated with each pass. When I finally found it, it was clipped to a seat harness in the secondary cabin, a place it had no reason to be. The harness belonged to no one I knew. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the harness and the empty seat it was attached to. The fabric looked worn, creased in ways that suggested repeated use. My first impulse was to report it, to demand an explanation, but that same reluctance rose up again, stronger this time. I unclipped the tool, returned it to storage, and pretended I'd never seen where it had been. From then on, small signs accumulated, each one insignificant on its own, but unsettling in their consistency. A meal packet gone missing. A mug left in the drying rack I didn't recognize. Footsteps implied by scuffed flooring where no one should have been walking. Each discovery came with a prickle of guilt, as if I were complicit simply by noticing and choosing not to act. Control's check-ins continued as usual, their tone steady and unremarkable. Once, during a lull, I almost brought it up, phrasing a careful question about manifest discrepancies in my head. The moment passed, swallowed by routine chatter, and I let it go. Part of me didn't want an answer. Answers would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement felt like a kind of betrayal. The guilt sharpened when I realized the extra consumption wasn't just oxygen. Water usage was slightly elevated too, along with waste processing. The systems were quietly accommodating something, or someone, without protest. I started to feel like the only one resisting, and even that resistance was half-hearted at best. There was a sense, growing stronger by the day, that the rules weren't just about survival but about complicity. I began to avoid the secondary cabin entirely. Passing its door made my stomach knot, a physical reaction I couldn't talk myself out of. Once, when turbulence rippled through the structure, I thought I heard movement from inside, a shifting of weight that suggested someone bracing themselves. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to repeat, but it didn't. The silence afterward felt heavy with implication. Sleep became difficult, not because of fear, exactly, but because of the constant low-level awareness that I was ignoring something that mattered. In dreams, I found myself counting seats, always coming up one short, or one too many, never landing on a number that felt right. I woke each time with the same thought echoing faintly, "You know better." The worst moment came during an emergency drill. Protocol required a head count verification, each crew member confirming their status in sequence. As the confirmations came in, I tracked them against the manifest automatically, a habit I couldn't break. When the last expected confirmation arrived, there was a pause, just long enough to register, before control moved on without comment. The count balanced, somehow, despite the extra seat. After the drill, I sat alone, hands shaking slightly, a weight pressing on my chest that felt uncomfortably like remorse. By not asking, by not insisting on clarity, I had allowed the system to adjust around the discrepancy. Whatever the extra seat represented, it had been folded into normalcy, made invisible through compliance. The thought that I might have prevented something, simply by speaking up earlier, lodged in me like a splinter. I still checked the manifest every shift. The extra seat remains, unchanged, a quiet constant at the bottom of the list. I don't ask about it, I don't acknowledge it. But the guilt hasn't faded, and lately it's been joined by a new, colder realization. If something goes wrong, if there's an evacuation or a failure that forces hard choices, that extra seat will matter, and my silence will be part of the reason why. I discovered Rule 10. If a sensor reads an impossible value, do not attempt to correct it yourself during a shift that had started normally, which made it all the more terrifying. The deep-sea probe's environmental sensors were supposed to be infallible, or at least, they were infallible enough to rely on without hesitation. Temperature, pressure, oxygen levels, even subtle chemical compositions, everything was logged automatically, feeding the system that kept us alive and on schedule. I had never thought twice about the readings, until that moment when one of them blinked impossibly. It was the pressure sensor on the port side. The reading jumped to a number that shouldn't exist at that depth, a value that would have crushed the hull instantly if true. My first reaction was disbelief. I checked the calibration and system logs. No malfunctions, no maintenance alerts, nothing that could account for it. My eyes went back to the readout, my stomach tightening. It didn't make sense. I pressed a few controls reflexively, thinking maybe I could override it, bring it back into a sane range. Then the rule came to mind, sharp and uncompromising. Rule 10. If a sensor reads an impossible value, do not attempt to correct it yourself. I paused, hand hovering over the input panel, heart racing. I knew what instinctive correction could do. One wrong command, 1 second of impatience, and I might trigger a real failure. My mind argued that the reading was impossible, physically impossible, and therefore must be a glitch. Yet the clarity of the rule told me that the very act of trying to fix it was riskier than leaving it alone. I waited, breathing slowly, trying to ground myself in logic, while acknowledging the fear pooling in my chest. I ran through contingencies in my head. If the reading was wrong, control could recalibrate remotely, verify the anomaly, cross-check with redundant systems. If I touched it myself, the line between simulated danger and actual catastrophe blurred instantly. Every nerve in my body urged me to act, to wrest control back from the system that appeared to be failing. But the rule held me in place. Minutes stretched, The sensor continued to flash the impossible value. The rest of the cabin hummed with the usual machinery, oblivious to my internal panic. I tried focusing on other instruments, cross-referencing oxygen levels, battery life, propulsion logs. Everything else was within expected ranges, normal, safe. That isolation, the contrast between the mechanical calm and my racing heartbeat, made the anomaly feel alive, a deliberate provocation. I tried to think about the previous incidents with other rules, how every warning had prepared me for moments exactly like this. Rule 10. If a sensor reads an impossible value, do not attempt to correct it yourself. Wasn't just about sensors. It was about restraint, about resisting the deep, human urge to act first and think later. I repeated it quietly to myself, over and over, as if saying it aloud could anchor reality. The anomaly persisted. I considered calling control, but the comms were scheduled for staggered check-ins. The system encouraged autonomy, unless there was immediate danger. That delay made the wait excruciating. My eyes flicked back to the readout, and for a moment, I could almost see the impossibility pressing against the glass, daring me to intervene. I reminded myself that the rule existed, because intervention could be exactly what turned simulation into disaster. I sat back, shoulders tight, letting the pulse of the hull beneath me be my only sensory anchor. I imagined the sensor as a silent observer, something the probe used to test responses, not just measure the environment. Each impossible reading, each anomaly, wasn't necessarily real. It was an invitation. My rational brain screamed that nothing physical could be happening, but every instinct said that perception wasn't the point. Compliance, patience, and observation were the survival tools. By the time control called, the reading had begun to normalize, slipping back into plausible ranges without my interference. I reported it carefully, avoiding any admission of attempted adjustment. Control confirmed that the anomaly was likely a temporary system misalignment, corrected automatically by redundancy checks. The relief I felt was muted because I knew that if I had pressed even one button, I could have invalidated the safety net entirely. Rule 10. If a sensor reads an impossible value, do not attempt to correct it yourself, felt heavier than ever, like a tangible weight pressing against my chest. After that incident, I treated every reading with a cautious reverence, even the ones that made sense. Each sensor had authority now. Its values were not suggestions, but rules I had to obey implicitly. I realized how fragile control was in this environment, how the illusion of mastery could dissolve in a single impulsive action. The impossibility of the measurement wasn't the danger itself, it was the temptation to defy protocol that mattered. I started logging everything meticulously, noting anomalies, no matter how trivial, and recording my restraint as proof I hadn't acted recklessly. The psychological strain of holding back became almost as challenging as the physical pressure outside. I would glance at the port side sensor many times a shift, each time resisting the urge to correct it, repeating the rule in my head, as if it were a mantra. Even now, I can recall the flicker of that impossible number, the way it seemed to mock my training and instinct simultaneously. Each time I visualize it, I remember the cold reality of choice, act or obey. Obedience carried a slow, steady tension. Action could have been immediate catastrophe. The lesson of Rule 10: if a sensor reads an impossible value, do not attempt to correct it yourself, had embedded itself deeply, shaping not just how I interacted with instruments, but how I interacted with fear itself. From that day on, I treated anomalies not as problems to solve but as tests to endure. The impossible reading never returned, but the memory lingered, a constant reminder that in this environment, patience and restraint were more powerful than any corrective action. And even now, when I see a number that shouldn't exist, I don't touch it. I wait, breathe, and let the rule guide me, because the last time someone ignored it, the consequences were silent, unseen, and unforgettable. I understood Rule 11. If control tells you the mission is complete, wait for the second confirmation before you leave. The moment the words reached me, because by then I wanted nothing more than to believe them. Control's voice was calm, almost warm, when they said the primary objectives were fulfilled, and I should begin shutdown procedures. After everything that had happened, that sentence felt like mercy. My body reacted before my mind, shoulders loosening, breath coming easier, the idea of an ending settling over me like a blanket. I started the checklist automatically, fingers moving through motions I'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Power down sequences, data locks, containment verifications. Each completed step felt like shedding weight, like I was getting lighter the closer I came to leaving. Control stayed on the line, offering small acknowledgments, nothing out of the ordinary. It would have been so easy to accept that as confirmation, to let relief carry me the rest of the way. Halfway through the sequence, the rule surfaced, heavy and unwelcome. Rule 11. If Control tells you the mission is complete, wait for the second confirmation before you leave. I slowed, reading the next step twice, without executing it. My chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with something closer to exhaustion. I didn't want another rule. I didn't want another delay. I wanted the story to stop where it was. I asked Control to repeat the completion status, framing it as a procedural double-check. There was a pause, longer than usual, long enough for doubt to creep in. Then they repeated it, word for word, voice steady. My hand hovered over the final release command. One confirmation, repeated, still counted as one. The rule didn't say hear it twice. It said wait for the second confirmation. And I hated how specific that felt now. Time stretched again, that familiar distortion settling in. I stood there, suspended between obedience and escape, aware of how close I was to breaking the pattern at the very end. The idea that the final test was patience felt cruel. Control didn't prompt me, didn't ask why I'd stopped. The silence pressed in, not hostile, just expectant. It reminded me too much of other pauses, other moments where acting too soon had consequences. I filled the silence myself, asking Control to confirm that all secondary conditions were met. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, like it belonged to someone else. They responded immediately, reassuring, listing metrics and statuses that aligned with what I could see. Everything checked out. Still, I didn't move. Rule 11. If Control tells you the mission is complete, wait for the second confirmation before you leave, repeated in my mind. No longer a warning, but a boundary. The second confirmation didn't come right away. Minutes passed, then more. Control stayed connected, their presence steady, almost comforting. I began to wonder if this was it. If the rule meant waiting indefinitely, proving compliance by never crossing the threshold. The thought stirred a quiet panic. What if leaving was the mistake, and staying was the real test? What if the mission was only complete for those who didn't survive it? Then Control spoke again, unprompted this time, their tone subtly different. They said the mission was complete, and that I was cleared to exit. The phrasing changed just enough to matter. I felt a strange resistance rise in me, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. This was the second confirmation, clean and distinct. According to the rule, this was the moment I was allowed to act. I initiated the final sequence, hands trembling slightly despite myself. Systems powered down in careful order, displays dimming one by one. With each step, the space felt emptier, quieter, like something withdrawing. I tried not to think about what had been holding on until now, or why it cared whether I left correctly. The process was almost complete when a new message appeared on the console, flagged as informational, not urgent. It was a brief log entry, time-stamped just seconds earlier, stating that mission parameters were still under review. My heart lurched. I froze, staring at the contradiction, mind racing. Control was still on the line, still calm. I asked them about the log, forcing my voice to stay even. There was another pause, and when they answered, they told me to disregard it, a system artifact, nothing more. I stood there, caught between instructions and evidence, feeling the weight of every previous rule pressing in. I thought about the clocks, the footage, the manifest, all the times reality had insisted on its own version of events. Rule 11. If control tells you the mission is complete, wait for the second confirmation before you leave, had guided me this far. But it didn't account for what happened after obedience. It didn't promise safety, only procedure. I asked control to confirm again. The line went quiet. Not dead, just empty, like someone had muted themselves intentionally. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened screens, older than I remembered, eyes tired, but alert. I realized then that the rule wasn't about leaving at all. It was about choosing which voice you trusted when endings were offered too neatly. The silence stretched, and in it I felt something shift, a pressure not outside the hull but inside my chest, like anticipation. I kept my hand away from the release, waiting for words that might never come, aware that whatever happened next would define everything that followed, and that somewhere something was very interested in whether I waited or not. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more. Miter what it arose.